Sometimes the most desperate moments reveal the bravest parts of ourselves. Sometimes asking for what we need becomes the first step toward changing everything we thought was impossible. In the cold halls of Norway, a slave woman named Marci had served her Viking master for 7 long years. She swept his floors, mended his clothes, and never asked for anything beyond the thin soup that barely kept her alive. Her master, Bjorn the Ruthless, was the most feared warrior in the northern lands. One evening, as Bjorn pushed away a plate of barely touched meat, hunger finally gave Marci the courage she never knew she had. "My lord," she whispered, her heart pounding, "may I have your leftovers?" The great hall went completely silent. Every warrior stopped eating. Every servant froze where they stood. No slave had ever dared speak to Bjorn like this. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched like a taut bowstring, ready to snap. Marci's words hung in the air above the great hall of Bjorn the Ruthless, where the warmth of the central fire pit could not reach the chill that had suddenly settled over every soul present. The carved wooden beams overhead, blackened by years of smoke and decorated with the shields of fallen enemies, seemed to press down upon the assembled warriors and servants with the weight of tradition itself. Marci stood frozen beside the long oak table where she had been clearing away the remnants of the evening feast. In her weathered hands, she still held the wooden bowl she had been using to collect scraps that would normally go to the dogs or be thrown into the waste pit behind the kitchens. Her fingers, rough from years of washing clothes in icy streams and grinding grain until her knuckles bled, trembled against the smooth wood. 7 winters had passed since the day she had been dragged from her burning village in the hills of what the Vikings called the Western Lands. She had been barely more than a child then, the daughter of a Celtic chieftain named Cormac the Bold, though that life felt like a distant dream now. On that terrible morning, Viking longships had appeared through the morning mist, like the harbingers of Ragnarok itself. Her father had fought bravely, his men forming a shield wall at the village gates, but there had been too many raiders, too much fire, too much death. She remembered the moment when everything changed, when a massive Viking warrior with arms like tree trunks had lifted her from where she cowered beside her mother's body. She had expected death, had even welcomed it, but instead found herself bound with rope and marched toward the black ships that waited at the shore. The last thing she saw of her homeland was the smoke rising from her father's hall, carrying with it the dreams of her childhood. The journey to this northern stronghold had been a blur of cold seas, cramped quarters below deck, and the constant fear that came with being property rather than a person. When they finally reached Bjorn's domain, a sprawling settlement built into the cliffs overlooking a fjord so deep its bottom had never been found, she learned what it meant to be a slave in the land of the Northmen. Bjorn the Ruthless was not a man who had earned his name through empty boasting. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms marked by the scars of 100 battles. His beard, now streaked with silver, fell to his chest like a waterfall of iron, and his eyes held the cold blue of winter seas. It was said that he had never lost a fight, never backed down from a challenge, and never shown mercy to an enemy. His reputation stretched from the frozen wastes of the far north to the green shores of Ireland, and even the boldest jarls spoke his name with respect, tinged by fear. Yet in all her years of service, Marci had observed something in Bjorn that others seemed to miss. When he thought no one was watching, when the weight of leadership pressed too heavily upon his shoulders, she had seen him stare into the fire with eyes that held more than just the hardness of war. She had watched him hesitate before making decisions that would send young men to their deaths. She had seen him run his fingers along the carved wooden cross that hung hidden beneath his leather tunic, a trophy from some long-ago raid, perhaps, or something more personal that he dared not display openly. The great hall itself was a testament to Bjorn's power and the harsh beauty of the northern world. Massive tree trunks formed the supporting pillars, each one carved with intricate patterns that told the stories of gods and heroes. The walls were lined with weapons and shields taken from defeated enemies, and hanging from the rafters were banners that bore the marks of every clan that had sworn allegiance to Bjorn's rule. At the far end of the hall stood the high seat, carved from a single piece of oak and decorated with silver inlay that caught the firelight like captured stars. Astrid, the head servant, who had become something like a mother to Marci over the years, stood near the kitchens with her mouth open in shock. She was a woman of middle years, whose own story was written in the lines around her eyes. Another soul claimed by Viking raids, another life reshaped by conquest. Her hair, once golden, had turned the color of autumn grass, and her hands bore the calluses of countless years spent in service. She had taken Marci under her protection when the girl first arrived, teaching her the unspoken rules that kept slaves alive in a world where their lives held less value than a good horse. Never speak unless spoken to, Astrid had whispered during those first terrifying nights. Never look them directly in the eyes. Never ask for anything. Survive, child. That is all we can do. Survive and hope that the gods have not forgotten us entirely. Eric, Bjorn's son and heir, sat at his father's right hand with his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. At 25 years of age, he was already a formidable warrior in his own right, but he carried himself with the particular intensity of a man trying to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. His hair was the color of ripened wheat, braided with silver rings that marked his victories in battle, and his blue eyes held the same cold fire as his father's. Eric had never been cruel to the slaves, but neither had he shown them particular kindness. They were simply part of the landscape of his life, as unchanging and unremarkable as the stones that formed the hall's foundation. Near the fire pit sat Helga, the settlement's eldest resident and its unofficial keeper of wisdom. She was ancient by Viking standards, perhaps 60 years or more, yet her mind remained sharp as a newly forged blade. Her white hair was braided with small bones and colored stones, marking her as a vulva, a woman who could speak with the spirits and read the signs that the gods sent to guide the living. Her pale eyes seemed to see through the surface of things to the deeper currents that moved beneath, and even Bjorn sought her counsel when facing the most difficult decisions. The other warriors at the long tables, men whose names were spoken with fear from Greenland to the Black Sea, sat motionless as carved statues. There was Ragnar Bloodaxe, whose red beard was said to be stained permanently with the blood of his enemies. Beside him sat Olaf the Berserker, a man who could enter such a fury in battle that some claimed he took on the spirit of a wolf. At the far table, Gunnar the Skald worked his way through a horn of mead while his fingers absently plucked at the strings of his harp, though no music emerged in the crushing silence. The serving girls and kitchen slaves stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with terror at what Marci had dared to do. They knew, as she knew, that slaves who overstepped their bounds could face punishments, ranging from a beating to being thrown from the cliffs into the icy fjord below. Some masters might show mercy for a first offense, but Bjorn the Ruthless was not known for his forgiveness. Hidden beneath her rough woolen dress, pressed against her heart, Marci carried her most precious possession, a small wooden cross that her mother had given her on the morning of that terrible raid. It was carved from rowan wood and marked with Celtic knots that spoke of faith and hope, and the belief that love could endure beyond death itself. She had hidden it well, knowing that the Northmen's gods were jealous and that their tolerance for foreign beliefs was limited. Yet in her darkest moments, when the weight of slavery threatened to crush her spirit entirely, she would press her fingers against the hidden cross and remember who she had been before the longships came. The fire crackled and spat, sending shadows dancing across the faces of the frozen assembly. Outside, the wind howled through the settlement like the voices of the restless dead, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack with a sound that spoke of hunger and longing. The smell of roasted meat and warm bread filled the air, a cruel reminder of abundance that remained forever beyond a slave's reach. Marci could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, could sense the barely contained violence that simmered just beneath the surface of Viking society. These were people who lived by the sword and died by it, who measured worth in terms of courage and strength and the willingness to take what they desired by force. In their world, weakness was not merely scorned, it was a crime punishable by death or exile, which amounted to the same thing in the harsh northern wilderness. Yet something had stirred within her as she watched Bjorn push away that joint of venison, barely touched and still warm from the fire. It was more than hunger, though the gods knew she was always hungry. It was something deeper, a rebellion against the accepted order of things, a refusal to remain invisible and silent while abundance rotted before her eyes. For 7 years, she had watched and learned and endured, but tonight, for reasons she could not fully explain, even to herself, enough was enough. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she could taste copper in her mouth as she bit down on her tongue to keep from taking back her words. But there was no taking them back now. They had been spoken, heard by every soul in the great hall, and whatever came next would shape not only her fate, but the fate of everyone who lived within these walls. In the silence, she became acutely aware of details she had never noticed before, the way the firelight caught the silver threads in Bjorn's beard, the sound of her own breathing harsh and rapid in the stillness, the smell of pine sap from the logs that fed the fire. Time seemed to stretch like hot metal on an anvil, each second drawn out until it became an eternity of waiting and watching and wondering whether the next breath she drew would be her last. The wooden cross pressed against her heart seemed to grow warm, as if responding to her desperate need for strength. She thought of her father, who had died defending his people. She thought of her mother, who had faced her death with dignity, even as the flames consumed everything she had ever loved. She thought of the girl she had been before the world changed, and the woman she had become through 7 years of careful survival. Whatever happened next, she would face it as her parents had taught her, with courage, with dignity, and with the knowledge that some things were worth the risk of death itself. The silence shattered like ice on a spring morning when Bjorn's deep laughter rolled through the great hall. It was not the cruel laugh of a man about to deliver punishment, but something altogether more surprising, genuine amusement, mixed with what sounded almost like admiration. The sound echoed off the wooden beams and stone walls, bouncing back upon itself until it filled every corner of the vast space. 7 years, Bjorn said, his voice carrying the weight of contemplation as he leaned back in his carved chair. 7 years you have served in my hall, and never once have you asked for anything beyond what was given. He reached for the golden arm ring that encircled his thick bicep, a band of metal so pure it seemed to capture and hold the firelight within its gleaming surface. The ring had been a gift from his father, forged by the finest smiths in all the northern lands, and it was worth more than most men would see in a lifetime. With deliberate movements that held the attention of every person in the hall, Bjorn slipped the ring from his arm and placed it on the wooden table before him. The soft thud of gold meeting oak seemed to reverberate through the stunned silence like thunder. "Sit!" he commanded, gesturing to the bench across from his high seat. "Eat with me." The collective intake of breath from the assembled warriors and servants was audible. Eric's knuckles went white where they gripped his drinking horn, and Astrid's face had gone pale as fresh snow. Even Helga, who claimed to have seen all manner of strange things in her long life, leaned forward with her ancient eyes wide with surprise. Marci felt the world tilt beneath her feet. In all her years of slavery, she had never imagined such a moment. Slaves ate in the kitchens, standing over scraps and cold gruel after the masters had finished. They certainly did not sit at the high table, did not share the warmth of the central fire, did not break bread with warriors whose names were sung in poems across the known world. "My lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire, "I cannot." You can, Bjorn interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. You ask for my leftovers. I offer you something better. A place at my table where we might speak as civilized people do. He gestured again to the bench, more forcefully this time. Sit. The journey from where she stood to the bench felt like walking through deep snow, each step requiring enormous effort, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. She was acutely aware of every eye upon her, could feel the weight of tradition and expectation pressing down like a physical force. The golden arm ring lay before the empty place Bjorn had indicated, catching the firelight and throwing tiny reflections across the scarred surface of the table. As she lowered herself onto the bench, soft furs and carved wood that felt impossibly luxurious, after years of hard stools and cold floors, the gravity of what was happening began to settle upon her. She was breaking every law of their society, violating customs that had been established long before her birth. Yet Bjorn himself had commanded it, and his word was absolute within these walls. "Tell me your name," Bjorn said, reaching for a platter of roasted fowl and placing a generous portion before her. The meat was still warm, seasoned with herbs she could smell but not identify, accompanied by bread so fresh it still steamed when broken open. "Marci, my lord," she replied, her hands hovering uncertainly over the food. Part of her feared this was some elaborate test, that she would be punished the moment she showed desire for what was offered. "Marci," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "And before you came to my hall, what were you called then?" The question struck her like a physical blow. For 7 years, she had been simply slave or girl or you there. Her true name, her heritage, her identity, all had been stripped away as thoroughly as her freedom. I was called Marci, daughter of Cormac, my lord, of the hill fort of Dunailin. Eric slammed his drinking horn down on the table with enough force to slosh mead across the wood. "Father, this is madness. She is a slave. Our enemies will see this as weakness, our allies as insult. You cannot—" "I can do as I please in my own hall," Bjorn said quietly, but his voice carried the edge of cold steel. "Or have you forgotten who rules here?" Eric's jaw worked silently for a moment before he managed. "No, father. I have not forgotten." "Good." Bjorn turned his attention back to Marci, who sat frozen between the two powerful men like a rabbit caught between wolves. "Eat, Marci, daughter of Cormac. Tell me of this hill fort. Tell me of your father." The food before her smelled like heaven itself, but her stomach had knotted with tension until she could barely think of eating. Still, she forced herself to take a small bite of the roasted bird, and the flavors that burst across her tongue nearly brought tears to her eyes. It had been so long since she had tasted properly seasoned food, so long since warmth and abundance had been within her reach. "My father was a chieftain," she said carefully, aware that every word might be her last. "He ruled over 3 villages and held lands that stretched from the great river to the standing stones of our ancestors. He was a good man, my lord, fair in his judgments, generous to his people. And yet he fell to Viking raiders," Bjorn observed, though his tone held no mockery. "What made him vulnerable?" The question surprised her with its tactical nature. She had expected cruelty or dismissal, not what sounded like genuine military interest. "We had no warning, my lord. The ships came with the morning mist, and we had grown comfortable. Too comfortable. My father had made peace with the neighboring clans, and we thought ourselves safe behind our walls." Bjorn nodded slowly, as if filing away this information for future use. "Comfort is the enemy of survival. Your father learned this too late." Around them, the hall remained unnaturally quiet. The other warriors ate in hushed tones, shooting glances toward the high table where an impossible scene was unfolding. The serving girls moved like ghosts, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell had fallen over their master. Even the dogs that usually fought over scraps beneath the tables lay still and watchful. "What skills do you possess beyond cleaning and mending?" Bjorn asked, refilling her cup with mead from his own pitcher, a gesture so intimate and unprecedented that it sent fresh murmurs through the watching crowd. Marci hesitated, knowing that her answer might reveal more than was safe. But something in Bjorn's manner encouraged honesty, and she found herself speaking truths she had hidden for years. "I can read and write, my lord, in 3 languages. My father believed that knowledge was as important as strength, and he had me educated alongside my brothers." "Brothers?" Eric leaned forward sharply. "How many brothers?" "2, my lord," she replied, glancing nervously between father and son. "Though I know not if they survived the raid." Eric and Bjorn exchanged a look, weighted with meaning that Marci could not decipher. Knowledge was power in the Viking world, and information about surviving Celtic nobility could prove valuable in ways she was only beginning to understand. "What else?" Bjorn pressed. "I know the healing arts, my lord, the properties of herbs and the setting of bones. My mother was skilled in such things, and she passed her knowledge to me." Again, this was dangerous territory. Viking society respected strength above all, but they also valued those who could preserve that strength when battle took its toll. Helga spoke for the first time since the meal began, her cracked voice carrying clearly across the hall. "The girl has the look of one touched by the sight," Bjorn Ironside. "See how the shadows gather around her. See how the fire bends toward her words. She is more than she appears." The Volva's pronouncement sent a chill through the assembled company. To be marked as one with mystical abilities was both a blessing and a curse in the northern lands. It brought respect, but also suspicion and fear. Bjorn studied Marci with new intensity, his blue eyes searching her face as if looking for signs of hidden power. "Is this true, daughter of Cormac? Do you see beyond the veil that blinds ordinary mortals?" Marci felt trapped between honesty and survival. To claim mystical powers might elevate her status, but it could just as easily mark her for death if she was seen as a threat. "I sometimes dream of things that come to pass, my lord, and I can sense the sickness in plants and animals before it shows itself fully. But I make no claim to great power." The golden arm ring seemed to pulse with inner light as Bjorn reached across the table and pushed it closer to her. "From this night forward, you will take your meals at this table. You will speak when spoken to, and you will answer my questions with the honesty you have shown tonight." He paused, his gaze intense enough to burn. "But know this, Marci, daughter of Cormac, this gesture comes with a price. There are those who will see kindness as weakness, generosity as foolishness. Your life has become more precious tonight, but also more dangerous." As if summoned by his words, a commotion arose near the hall's great doors. The guard stepped aside to admit a group of travel-worn warriors, their cloaks heavy with snow and their faces grim with purpose. At their head walked a man Marci recognized from descriptions whispered in the kitchens, Sven the Red, a rival Jarl whose lands bordered Bjorn's territory and whose ambitions were said to know no bounds. "Bjorn Ironside," Sven called out, his voice carrying across the now silent hall. "I come seeking counsel with you on matters that concern all who rule in these lands." Bjorn's expression had shifted, the warmth of moments before, replaced by the cold calculation of a war leader facing a potential threat. "You are welcome in my hall, Sven Eriksson, though I note you come with more warriors than a friendly visit would require." Sven's gaze fell upon Marci, sitting at the high table with the golden arm ring gleaming before her, and his eyes narrowed with interest that felt predatory. "I see you have elevated your entertainment since last we met. How progressive of you." The insult was clear, and Eric half rose from his seat with his hand moving toward his sword hilt. But Bjorn raised a hand for calm, though his own eyes had gone cold as winter seas. "Marci, daughter of Cormac, sits at my table by my invitation and my will," Bjorn said, his voice carrying the unmistakable edge of threat. "She has earned her place through 7 years of faithful service. I trust this meets with your approval." The challenge was unmistakable, and the hall held its collective breath as two of the most powerful men in the northern lands faced each other across a divide that seemed to grow wider by the moment. Whatever Sven had come to discuss, Marci realized with growing dread. Her presence at the high table had just made everything infinitely more complicated. 3 days had passed since Sven's unexpected arrival, and the settlement buzzed with undercurrents of tension that seemed to thicken the very air. Marci sat at the high table for the 3rd evening in a row, still hardly believing the reality of her transformed circumstances. The golden arm ring now rested on a leather cord around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. Bjorn had insisted she keep it, though wearing it openly would have invited more trouble than either of them was prepared for. The evening meal had become a careful dance of protocol and politics. Marci ate slowly, hyper-aware of every gesture, every word, every glance exchanged between the powerful men who now shared her presence. Sven sat at Bjorn's left hand as an honored guest, his cold eyes frequently settling on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Tell me, Bjorn," Sven said, cutting into a piece of roasted venison with deliberate precision. "Have you given thought to the proposition I brought? The Saxon settlements to the south grow fat with gold, and their defenses remain weak. A joint raid would bring glory and wealth to both our peoples." Bjorn chewed thoughtfully before responding. "I have given it thought, as promised, but I find myself questioning the wisdom of such ventures these days. The Saxons grow stronger each season, and their kings have begun forming alliances. What seems easy prey today may prove to be a trap tomorrow." Eric shifted uncomfortably beside his father, and Marci caught the quick glance he exchanged with Sven. Something unspoken passed between them, a communication that made her stomach tighten with unease. She had grown skilled at reading the subtle languages of power during her years of servitude, and what she saw now spoke of secrets and divided loyalties. "Caution has its place," Sven agreed, though his tone suggested he found such caution distasteful. "But so does opportunity. The Celtic chieftains still resist our expansion westward, but they are divided and weak. A show of strength now could secure decades of tribute and expansion." At the mention of Celtic chieftains, Marci's hand instinctively moved to touch the hidden cross at her throat. Sven's words painted her people as obstacles to be removed, resources to be harvested, and the casual cruelty of it stirred something fierce and protective within her chest. "The Celts have deep roots in their lands," she found herself saying, before wisdom could stop her tongue. "Like oak trees, they bend in storms but rarely break entirely, and when they do, unite against a common threat." The hall fell silent once again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Where 3 nights ago it had been shock at a slave's audacity, now it carried the tension of political maneuvering and the recognition that Marci's words might carry more weight than her station would normally allow. Sven's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. "The slave speaks of things beyond her understanding. Tell me, girl, what do you know of warfare and strategy?" "I know what I lived through," Marci replied, meeting his gaze despite the fear that clawed at her throat. "I saw how my father's enemies thought they understood our weaknesses, how they believed their strength would carry the day. They won that battle, but at such cost that they gained little from their victory." Bjorn leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving between Marci and Sven with the calculating gaze of a man weighing options. "There is wisdom in understanding one's enemies. Continue, Marci." The encouragement both thrilled and terrified her, but she pressed on. "Celtic warriors fight differently when defending their homes than when raiding for plunder. They know every stone, every stream, every hiding place in their territory. They have networks of allies and kin that stretch across vast distances. Strike at one clan, and 3 others may come to their aid. Defeat them in one place, and they simply fade into the hills to fight another day." "You speak as if you sympathize with our enemies," Eric said, his voice tight with suspicion and something that might have been jealousy. "I speak as one who has seen both sides of conquest," Marci replied carefully. "I know the cost of defeat, but I also remember the strength that comes from defending what you love." Sven set down his knife with a soft click that seemed to echo through the hall. Interesting perspective. And what of loyalty, girl? Where do your sympathies truly lie? The question hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Marci felt the weight of every gaze upon her, understood that her answer might determine not only her own fate, but potentially the course of future conflicts. The birch bark hidden in her sleeping alcove suddenly seemed to burn in her memory, the fragment on which she had scratched out the words of an old Celtic song, her secret act of rebellion against the erasure of her identity. "My loyalty is to truth, my lord," she said finally, "and to those who have shown me kindness in dark times." It was a diplomat's answer, carefully neutral yet pregnant with meaning. Bjorn's slight nod suggested approval, while Sven's eyes narrowed with what might have been respect or calculation. Astrid appeared at Marci's shoulder, refilling her cup with mead that trembled slightly in the older woman's hands. The head servant had grown increasingly anxious over the past 3 days, muttering prayers to half-forgotten gods and warning Marci that her newfound prominence would bring danger from quarters she could not imagine. "The girl treads dangerous waters," Astrid had whispered that morning as they worked together in the kitchens. "There are those who see your rise as an insult to their own honor. Be careful, child. Be very careful." Now, watching the interplay of tensions around the high table, Marci understood just how precarious her position had become. She was no longer invisible, no longer safely insignificant. Her words carried weight, but that weight could crush her as easily as elevate her. "Perhaps," Bjorn said, breaking the charged silence, "we might benefit from understanding our neighbors better before deciding whether to fight them or trade with them. Knowledge, as they say, is its own form of wealth." Sven's expression suggested he found such sentiments naive, but he merely nodded. "Of course, though I hope such understanding will not delay action beyond the point of usefulness. Opportunities have a way of vanishing if one contemplates them too long." The evening continued with discussions of trade routes, weather patterns, and the movement of ships along the coast. But underneath the mundane topics ran currents of disagreement that seemed to grow stronger with each exchange. Marci found herself studying the faces around the table, noting alliances and tensions that shifted like smoke in the wind. Eric's behavior troubled her most. The young man who had seemed merely suspicious of her elevation now appeared actively hostile, his contributions to the conversation frequently supporting Sven's more aggressive positions. When he looked at her, she saw something harder than mere resentment, a calculation that made her think of a hunter sizing up prey. As the evening drew to a close and the warriors began dispersing to their sleeping quarters, Bjorn touched her arm gently. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "There are things we must discuss." They stepped out into the crisp night air, where the aurora danced across the star-filled sky in sheets of green and gold. The settlement spread below them, cooking fires glowing like earthbound stars. The sound of distant laughter and conversation carried on the wind. "You spoke well tonight," Bjorn said, as they walked along the wooden walkway that connected the great hall to his private chambers. "But you also spoke dangerously. Do you understand the forces you are now part of?" Marci pulled her woolen cloak tighter against the cold. "I am beginning to, my lord, and I fear I may have brought trouble upon you through my words." "Trouble was coming regardless," Bjorn replied, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Your presence has simply made the battle lines clearer. The question now is whether we are prepared for what comes next." The morning brought news that would test everything Marci had come to understand about justice and mercy in the Viking world. A young man named Thorvald had been caught stealing grain from the communal stores enough to feed his family for a week, but a crime that traditionally carried the penalty of death or exile. As Bjorn held the court in the great hall, with Sven and his warriors as witnesses, the trembling thief knelt before the high seat with his wrists bound behind his back. Marci stood behind Bjorn's chair, a position she had gradually assumed over the past week as her role evolved from slave to something approaching an advisor. The change had happened so subtly that even she was surprised to find herself there, close enough to whisper counsel, yet visible to all who sought the Jarl's judgment. Thorvald was barely 20, with the lean build of someone who had known hunger too well and too often. His wife had recently given birth to their first child, and the harsh winter had stretched their meager resources beyond breaking. His crime was born of desperation rather than greed, a fact that was evident to everyone present, but which did little to mitigate the seriousness of his offense. "The law is clear," proclaimed Gunnar the lawkeeper, an elderly man whose memory held generations of legal precedent. "Theft from the common stores weakens us all. The penalty is death or permanent exile." Sven nodded approvingly from his seat at the left of the high table. "Justice must be swift and certain, or others will follow this man's example. Order depends upon the consistent application of law." Eric, seated at his father's right hand, wore an expression of grim agreement. "My Lord Father, the law exists to protect our people. To show mercy to lawbreakers invites chaos." Bjorn's massive frame was still as carved stone as he contemplated the kneeling man before him. His father's battle-axe hung on the wall behind the high seat, a weapon that had split the skulls of countless enemies and served as a reminder of the violent foundations upon which their society rested. The axe seemed to watch the proceedings with the cold patience of an executioner waiting for the order to strike. "Thorvald Grimson," Bjorn's voice rumbled through the hall like distant thunder, "you have heard the charges against you. Do you deny taking grain from the stores?" "No, my lord," Thorvald replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I took it. My wife. The baby was crying from hunger, and the milk was not enough. I thought. I hoped." "Hope does not excuse theft," Gunnar interjected sternly. "The law makes no allowance for circumstances, only for actions." Marci felt her heart clench as she watched the young father's shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. In her mind, she could see her own father dispensing justice in the hill fort of her childhood, how he would listen not just to the crime, but to the story behind it, how he sought solutions that strengthened the community rather than simply punishing the transgressor. She found herself leaning forward, close enough to Bjorn's ear that her words would reach him alone. "My lord," she whispered, "might I speak?" Bjorn turned slightly, his blue eyes meeting hers with a mixture of curiosity and warning. Around them, the hall waited in tense silence, aware that something unprecedented was occurring, but uncertain of its nature. "You may speak," Bjorn said, his voice carrying clearly through the assembly. "Let all hear the counsel of Marci, daughter of Cormac." The formal introduction sent a ripple of surprise through the gathered Vikings. To acknowledge her lineage publicly was to grant her a status far beyond that of a slave, and several warriors exchanged meaningful glances at this development. Marci stepped forward, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling. "My lord, the law speaks truly of the crime, but perhaps we might also consider the causes that led to it. Thorvald took grain not for profit or laziness, but because a child was hungry. In my father's hall, such cases were seen as failures of the community as much as failures of the individual." Sven's laugh was cold and mocking. "Celtic softness, no doubt. Tell me, girl, how many successful raids did your father's mercy inspire? How many enemies trembled at the thought of his kindness?" The barb struck deep, but Marci forced herself to remain calm. "My father's strength was not diminished by his wisdom, my lord. His people followed him not from fear alone, but from love and respect. They fought harder for him because they knew he would fight just as hard for them." "Pretty words," Eric said, his tone dismissive. "But words do not fill empty bellies or defend against raiders. The law exists for a reason. The law should serve the people, not rule them," Marci replied, surprised by her own boldness. "What if, instead of death or exile, Thorvald was required to work additional hours in the stores he robbed? Let him earn back what he took while learning the value of what he stole. Make him a guardian of the very thing he violated." Bjorn leaned back in his chair, his massive hands steepled before him as he considered her words. The battle axe on the wall seemed to pulse with ancestral authority, but for the first time in years, Bjorn found himself questioning whether the old ways were always the best ways. "An interesting proposal," he said slowly. "But what of deterrence? If word spreads that thieves face only additional labor, will that not encourage others to take what they have not earned?" "Let word spread that justice here is tempered with wisdom," Marci answered, "that Bjorn Ironside is strong enough to show mercy without weakness, wise enough to find solutions that strengthen rather than diminish his people. Let them know that a man who can protect his followers will also protect their children." The hall remained silent as Bjorn rose from his seat, his imposing figure casting long shadows in the firelight. Every eye followed him as he walked slowly around the high table to stand before the kneeling Thorvald. "Look at me," Bjorn commanded, and the young man raised his tear-streaked face. "You stole from your own people. You weakened us all through your desperation. This cannot be forgiven lightly." Thorvald's face crumpled, and he began to speak what sounded like final words to his absent wife and child. "However," Bjorn continued, raising his voice so all could hear, "it is said that a Jarl's true strength lies not in how swiftly he can destroy, but in how wisely he can build. You will work in the grain stores for the next 2 seasons without additional payment until you have returned double what you took. You will also serve as a guardian of those stores, watching for signs of want among our people, so that desperation need not drive them to theft." The murmur that ran through the assembly was one of surprise rather than approval. Several warriors exchanged glances that spoke of confusion, while others nodded thoughtfully at this new approach to justice. Sven's expression had grown thunderous. "Bjorn, this sets a dangerous precedent. Mercy is a luxury that leaders cannot afford." "Perhaps," Bjorn replied, returning to his seat, "or perhaps true strength lies in knowing when to bend so that we do not break. Time will tell which path serves our people better." As Thorvald was unbound and led away to begin his new duties, Marci felt the weight of every gaze in the hall settling upon her. She had spoken publicly, influenced a major decision, and in doing so had crossed another line that could never be uncrossed. The changes she had initiated were spreading like ripples in a pond, and she could only hope that when they reached the shore, they would not bring destruction in their wake. 2 weeks had passed since Thorvald's trial, and the changes in the settlement were becoming impossible to ignore. Word had spread beyond Bjorn's lands about the new form of justice being practiced, carrying with it whispers of weakness and innovation in equal measure. Some called it progressive, others called it dangerous, but none could deny that it was unprecedented in the harsh world of the Northmen. Marci walked through the settlement in the early morning light, no longer skulking in shadows, but moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. The silver brooch that now adorned her cloak was Bjorn's latest gift, a piece of exquisite Celtic knotwork that seemed to capture starlight in its intricate patterns. He had presented it to her 3 nights ago after she helped resolve a boundary dispute between 2 families without bloodshed, and wearing it felt like carrying a piece of her heritage openly for the first time in 7 years. The changes in her daily routine reflected her transformed status. Instead of rising before dawn to scrub floors and haul water, she now spent her mornings making rounds through the settlement, listening to the concerns of the people and bringing the most pressing issues to Bjorn's attention. It was work that felt natural to her, drawing on memories of watching her father govern with wisdom and compassion. At the grain stores, she found Thorvald diligently counting sacks and making notes on a piece of birch bark. His transformation had been remarkable. The desperate, hollow-eyed thief had become a dedicated guardian of the community's resources. When he saw her approaching, his face brightened with genuine gratitude. "Lady Marci," he said, using the title that had gradually emerged among the common people, "I wanted to show you what we've discovered." She followed him to where several sacks had been set aside, their contents spilling slightly onto the wooden floor. "Weevils," Thorvald explained, pointing to the small holes that marked infested grain. In the old days, this might have gone unnoticed until it spread to other stores. Now we catch it early and can salvage most of the grain while protecting the rest. You have done well, Marci said, genuinely pleased. Your attention to detail serves us all. I owe you my life, Thorvald replied quietly. If not for your words that day, my son would have grown up without a father. The debt can never be repaid. Such encounters had become common as word of her influence spread through the settlement. People who had once looked through her as if she were invisible now sought her counsel on matters ranging from family disputes to concerns about the changing weather patterns. She had become an unofficial mediator, a bridge between the common people and their lord. But not everyone welcomed these changes. As she made her way toward the Great Hall, she encountered Eric near the weapons training ground, where he was drilling with sword and shield under the watchful eye of Gunnar Ironhand, the settlement's master-at-arms. "Sister," Eric called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge as he used the term some warriors had begun applying to her. The word could be taken as respectful acknowledgement of her place in Bjorn's household, or as sarcasm barely concealing contempt. With Eric, she suspected the latter. "Good morning, Eric," she replied evenly, refusing to rise to his bait. "Your form looks sharp today. Sharp enough to remind anyone who might forget their proper place," he said, executing a particularly aggressive sequence of strikes against the practice post. Wood chips flew with each impact, and the sound echoed like war drums across the training ground. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sven, who approached with several of his warriors in tow. The visiting Jarl had extended his stay far beyond the normal bounds of hospitality, and his continued presence had become a source of growing tension. "Ah, the Celtic princess graces us with her presence," Sven said, his smile sharp as a wolf's grin. "I trust your morning rounds have been enlightening?" "I find that listening to people's concerns often reveals insights that might otherwise be missed," Marci replied carefully. "A wise leader seeks to understand their people's needs." "Indeed," Sven agreed, though his tone suggested he found such concerns beneath his notice. "Though I wonder whether such intimate involvement with the common folk might blur the necessary boundaries between ruler and ruled." Eric paused in his training, his attention clearly focused on the exchange, despite his apparent concentration on sword work. The tension between the three of them was palpable, like the charge in the air before a thunderstorm. "Strong boundaries can become rigid barriers," Marci said, thinking of her father's approach to leadership. "Sometimes flexibility serves better than inflexibility." "Flexibility," Sven mused, as if tasting the word, "an interesting concept, though one might argue that what you call flexibility others might see as weakness. The enemies gathering in the south certainly seem to interpret your lord's recent innovations in that light." The casual mention of enemies sent a chill down Marci's spine. "What enemies?" she asked, though part of her already feared the answer. Sven's smile widened. "Surely you've heard? The southern Jarls grow restless. They speak of Bjorn's softness, of how the great warrior has been tamed by a slave's whispers. Some suggest that a man who shows mercy to thieves might be too weak to defend his lands when real threats emerge." Eric's sword struck the practice post with particular violence, and Marci caught the look that passed between him and Sven. The connection she had suspected was becoming clearer. Eric's resentment and Sven's ambition were feeding off each other, creating a dangerous alliance within Bjorn's own household. "My father's strength has never been in question," Eric said, though his words carried an undertone that suggested he might question it himself. "But strength must be demonstrated, not merely assumed." "Wise words," Sven agreed. "Perhaps it is time for such demonstrations to be made clear to all who might doubt them." Marci felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, like ice breaking up in spring. The changes she had helped bring about were creating their own problems, generating resistance that might ultimately threaten everything she had come to value. Her influence with Bjorn had grown, but so had the forces arrayed against that influence. As she excused herself and continued toward the great hall, she could feel Sven's calculating gaze following her. The silver brooch at her throat suddenly felt heavy, like a target rather than an ornament. The path she had chosen was leading toward a confrontation she was not sure she was prepared for, but from which there seemed to be no retreat. Inside the hall, she found Bjorn studying a collection of carved wooden tokens, messages from other jarls and chieftains that had arrived with increasing frequency over the past week. His expression was troubled, and when he looked up at her approach, she could see the weight of leadership pressing heavily upon his broad shoulders. "Marci," he said, his voice carrying a weariness she had never heard before, "we must talk. The world beyond our borders grows restless, and decisions must be made that will affect us all." The silver brooch seemed to pulse with reflected firelight as she took her place beside his chair, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them both. The wooden tokens scattered across Bjorn's private table told a story of growing unrest that stretched across the northern territories like cracks in winter ice. Each carved piece bore the mark of a different jarl or chieftain, and collectively they painted a picture that made Marci's blood run cold. She stood beside Bjorn in his private chamber, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the grim collection of messages. "Jarl Thorson of the eastern settlements questions my fitness to hold these lands," Bjorn said, picking up a token carved with the image of a wolf. "He suggests that a man who listens to slave women might lack the strength to defend against Saxon raids." Marci's fingers traced the silver brooch at her throat as she studied the messages. "And Jarl Eriksson of the southern fjords proposes a gathering of the traditional council," Bjorn replied, indicating a token marked with crossed axes, "to discuss matters of mutual concern, which in the old tongue means to determine whether I still deserve their allegiance." The weight of responsibility settled on Marci's shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Her influence, her very presence in Bjorn's hall, had become a catalyst for forces that threatened to tear apart the careful balance of power that kept these lands stable. The changes she had advocated for mercy, wisdom, listening to the common people, were being interpreted as dangerous innovations by men whose worldview had been forged in blood and conquest. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "it would be wise for me to withdraw from public view. If my presence is causing difficulties, your presence is not the problem." Bjorn interrupted, his voice firm with conviction. "Their fear of change is the problem. For too long, we have ruled through strength alone, forgetting that true power comes from the willing support of those we lead." He moved to the window, gazing out at the settlement spread below them. In the distance, smoke rose from the workshops where craftsmen labored, and children played in the spaces between buildings while their mothers went about their daily tasks. It was a scene of peaceful productivity that would have been unthinkable during the constant raids and conflicts of previous years. "Look at what we have built," Bjorn continued, "not through conquest, but through wisdom. Our stores are fuller, our people more content, our defenses stronger, because those who defend them fight for something they value rather than something they fear to lose." A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Helga entered at Bjorn's invitation. The ancient vulva moved with the careful steps of one whose bones remembered too many winters, but her pale eyes remained sharp as polished steel. In her gnarled hands, she carried a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of bone and stone. "The runes speak of storms approaching," she said without preamble, settling herself on a low stool beside the fire. "I have cast them 3 times, and each time the message grows clearer. Great changes come, changes that will test the bonds between past and future." She poured the contents of her pouch onto the fur rug, carved pieces of bone, each marked with ancient symbols that predated the arrival of the White Christ in these lands. The runes scattered in patterns that seemed random to untrained eyes, but Helga studied them with the intensity of a warrior reading a battlefield. "Here," she said, pointing to a bone marked with intersecting lines, conflict within the family. And here, her finger moved to another rune, the necessity of choosing between old loyalties and new wisdom. Her gaze lifted to meet Marci's eyes. The gods speak of a bridge between worlds, child, but bridges can be destroyed as easily as they are built. What do the runes counsel? Bjorn asked, his voice carrying the respect that even the most practical Vikings showed to those who could speak with the spirits. Helga's weathered hand passed over the scattered bones, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. They counsel preparation. The test that comes will require all the strength you possess, both the strength of the sword and the strength of the heart. The old ways and the new must find balance, or both will be swept away. As if summoned by her words, urgent voices arose from the courtyard below. Bjorn moved quickly to the window, and Marci joined him to see a group of riders approaching through the settlement's main gate. Their horses were lathered with sweat despite the cold, and their urgent pace spoke of news that could not wait for proper protocols. "My lord," called the lead rider as he dismounted in the courtyard below, "I bring word from the southern borders. Jarl Magnus Bloodaxe has declared his intention to test your resolve. He marches north with 200 warriors, claiming the right to challenge your leadership before the traditional council." Bjorn's jaw tightened, and Marci could see the warrior he had always been stirring beneath the wise ruler he was becoming. Magnus Bloodaxe was not merely another rival Jarl, he was a relic of the old ways, a man who had built his reputation on the number of enemies he had personally killed and the amount of gold he had seized in raids. "When?" Bjorn called down to the messenger. 3 days, my lord. Perhaps 4 if the weather turns against him." Bjorn turned from the window, his expression grim with the knowledge that the confrontation they had all been dreading was finally at hand. "So it begins," he said quietly. "The old ways demand their trial by combat." Marci felt her heart sink as she realized the implications. A formal challenge from Magnus would require Bjorn to either fight or be seen as weak by every Jarl in the northern territories. But Magnus was 20 years younger, had spent his entire adult life in constant warfare, and possessed a reputation for savagery that made even hardened Vikings speak his name with caution. "There must be another way," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she knew how naive they sounded. "Perhaps," Bjorn replied, but his tone suggested he placed little hope in alternatives. "But we must prepare for the likelihood that words will not be sufficient." Helga gathered her runes with movements that spoke of resignation rather than surprise. "The stones spoke truly," she murmured. "The bridge will be tested in fire, and what emerges will be transformed beyond recognition." As evening fell over the settlement, Marci found herself standing at the edge of the cliff, overlooking the fjord, watching the aurora dance across the star-filled sky. The beauty of the northern lights seemed almost mocking in the face of the violence that approached. In 3 days, everything she had helped build might be destroyed, and the man she had come to care for more deeply than she dared admit might face death at the hands of a brutal enemy. The silver brooch at her throat caught the ethereal light of the aurora, and she found herself thinking of all the changes that had brought her to this moment. 7 years ago, she had been a broken girl, dragging herself through each day with nothing but survival as her goal. Now she stood as an advisor to a powerful Jarl, her words carrying weight that could influence the fate of entire communities. But with influence came responsibility, and with responsibility came the terrible knowledge that her choices might lead to consequences she was powerless to prevent. The storm Helga had foretold was coming, and when it struck, there would be nowhere to hide from its fury. The messenger who arrived at dawn carried more than urgent news. He carried the power to reshape everything. Marci thought she understood about her place in the world. She was breaking her fast with Bjorn when the young man stumbled into the great hall, his clothes torn by thorns and his face marked by exhaustion that spoke of hard riding through dangerous territory. "My lord Bjorn," the messenger gasped, falling to one knee before the high table. "I come from the western shores, from the lands beyond the great forest. I bear a message from one who claims kinship with the Lady Marci. The blood-stained letter he withdrew from his leather pouch seemed to pulse with significance in the morning light. Marci's hands trembled as she recognized the seal pressed into the wax, a Celtic knot surrounding a crowned stag, the symbol of her father's house. But her father was 7 years dead, killed in the raid that had brought her to this place. Bjorn broke the seal with careful fingers, his eyes scanning the contents, while Marci held her breath. The silence stretched until she thought her heart might stop beating entirely, and when he finally looked up, his expression carried a mixture of shock and something that might have been fear. "It is from your brother Cormac," he said quietly. "He lives, Marci. He lives and leads a confederation of Celtic clans that has grown powerful enough to challenge Viking expansion along the western coasts." The words hit her like a physical blow. Cormac alive, her older brother, who had been training to become their father's heir, who had taught her to read the old scripts and shown her the secret paths through the hills around their home. In her mind, he had been nothing more than a ghost for 7 years, another casualty of that terrible morning when the longships brought fire and death to her world. "What does he say?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. Bjorn's voice carried the formal tone of one, reading an official communication. "He writes that word has reached him of a Celtic woman who sits at the table of Bjorn Ironside, who bears the name of his lost sister and speaks with wisdom that echoes their father's teachings. He proposes a meeting not as enemies, but as leaders seeking to end the cycle of raid and revenge that has bled both our peoples white." The implications struck her like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. She was not simply Marci the slave, or even Marci the advisor. She was Marci, daughter of Cormac the Bold, sister to the man who had united the scattered Celtic clans into a force capable of standing against Viking expansion. Her blood made her a bridge between two worlds that had known nothing but conflict for generations. "He offers terms," Bjorn continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "A formal treaty between his confederation and my lands, an end to raiding in exchange for established trade routes, safe passage for merchants and travelers, and," he paused, the weight of the final words heavy in the air, "a marriage alliance to seal the agreement permanently." Eric, who had been listening from his place at the table, suddenly understood the full implications. "She could marry any of their chieftains," he said, his voice tight with realization. "Cement an alliance that would make our enemies think twice about challenging us." But Sven, who had appeared at the entrance to the hall just in time to hear the proposal, wore an expression of calculated interest that made Marci's skin crawl. "Or," he said, moving closer to the high table, "she could be used to drive a wedge between the Celtic clans." Imagine the chaos if word spread that Cormac's sister had been corrupted by her years among us, that she now served Viking interests rather than Celtic ones. The casual cruelty of the suggestion sent ice through Marci's veins. She could see the political calculations spinning behind Sven's eyes, how her existence could be weaponized, how her very identity could become a tool for manipulation and betrayal. "There is more," Bjorn said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Cormac writes that he has other intelligence to share. Magnus Bloodaxe, who marches against us even now, has been making overtures to certain Celtic clans. He promises them rich rewards for information about our defenses and safe passage for raids against our allies." The revelation sent a shock through the assembled company. Magnus was not simply challenging Bjorn's leadership, he was actively collaborating with enemies of all Viking peoples. The betrayal transformed what might have been an internal political dispute into something approaching treason. "If this is true," Eric said slowly, "then Magnus cannot be allowed to succeed. His victory would bring Celtic raiders directly into our heartland." Sven's expression had grown calculating. Convenient timing for such accusations to surface. "How do we know this Celtic chieftain speaks the truth? Perhaps this is simply an attempt to divide us against each other." Marci found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "My brother does not lie. If he says Magnus has made such agreements, then it is true. Your brother, Sven repeated, tasting the words like wine that might be poisoned. "Tell me, Lady Marci, where do your loyalties truly lie? With the man who has sheltered you these 7 years, or with the blood that flows in your veins?" The question hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Everyone in the hall understood that her answer would shape not only her own fate, but the fate of the alliance that her brother proposed. If she chose her Celtic heritage over her Viking loyalties, it might doom any chance of peace. If she chose Bjorn over her brother, it might close the door on the first real opportunity to end the cycle of violence that had consumed both peoples for generations. But before she could respond, a commotion arose from the courtyard. Shouts and the sound of running feet drew everyone's attention, and moments later Astrid burst into the hall with her face pale as fresh snow. "My lord," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "Riders approach under a banner of truce. But they are not Magnus's men, they are Celts, and they bear the same arms as those described in the letter." Bjorn rose from his seat, his massive frame imposing even in the face of such unprecedented developments. "How many?" "A dozen, my lord. No more. They come as envoys, not as a war party." The timing was either miraculous or disastrous, depending on one's perspective. With Magnus Bloodaxe approaching from the south and Celtic envoys arriving from the west, Bjorn's hall was about to become the center of negotiations that could reshape the balance of power across the entire northern world. "Bring them to the hall," Bjorn commanded. "Let us see what words they carry from this brother of yours, Marci." As Astrid hurried to carry out his orders, Marci felt the weight of destiny settling around her like a heavy cloak. The letter in Bjorn's hands had changed everything. She was no longer simply a former slave who had gained influence through wisdom and courage. She was a political asset of enormous value, a living bridge between warring peoples, and quite possibly the key to either lasting peace or devastating war. The blood-stained letter seemed to pulse with malevolent life as she stared at it, understanding now why it had been stained with red. Someone had died to get this message through. Perhaps multiple people had sacrificed their lives to ensure that word of her survival reached her brother's hands. The silver brooch at her throat suddenly felt like a chain, binding her to loyalties and obligations that pulled in different directions. Soon she would face her brother's envoys, men who would look at her and see not Marci the advisor, but Marci the Celtic princess, daughter of chieftains and sister to a war leader whose very existence threatened the Viking way of life. Whatever words were exchanged in the coming hours would determine not only her own future, but the future of two peoples who had known nothing but war for as long as anyone could remember. The bridge Helga had spoken of was about to be tested in ways none of them had imagined. The Celtic envoys entered Bjorn's hall like figures from a half-remembered dream, carrying with them the scents of distant forests and the weight of a world Marci had thought lost forever. Their leader was a man of middle years, with greying hair braided in the old style, and when his eyes found hers across the vast space of the great hall, recognition flared between them like lightning. "Finnegan," she whispered, rising from her place beside Bjorn's chair. The man had been her father's most trusted advisor, a warrior poet who had taught her the old songs and the deeper meanings hidden within the ancient stories. "Lady Marci," Finnegan replied, his voice thick with emotion as he executed a formal bow that acknowledged her not as a slave, but as the daughter of chieftains. 7 years we have mourned you as dead. 7 years your brother has carried the grief of believing himself the last of your father's line." The formal greeting sent ripples of surprise through the Viking assembly. These were not casual envoys come to negotiate from a position of weakness. They spoke to Marci with the respect due to royalty, confirming beyond doubt that her blood carried weight in the politics of the Western lands. Bjorn's voice carried carefully controlled authority as he addressed the Celtic delegation. "You are welcome in my hall, Finnegan of the Western clans. Your message spoke of terms that might interest us both." "Indeed, Lord Bjorn," Finnegan replied, though his eyes remained fixed on Marci. "But first, If I may, I would speak privately with the daughter of my old lord. There are words that pass between kinfolk that should not be shared with strangers, no matter how honored." The request was both reasonable and dangerous. Private conversations between Marci and the Celtic envoys could easily be seen as conspiracy, yet to refuse would be to treat her as a slave rather than the political figure she had apparently become. Sven stepped forward, his smile sharp as a blade. "Surely there can be no secrets between allies? If we are to negotiate in good faith, should not all parties hear what terms are being discussed?" But Bjorn's decision surprised everyone present. "Marci may speak with her kinsman as she chooses. When she is ready, we will hear what proposals they bring." The implicit trust in his words struck Marci like a physical blow. Even faced with political pressures and the threat of Magnus's approaching army, Bjorn was willing to grant her the autonomy to make her own choices. The weight of that trust settled on her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility she was not sure she was ready to bear. They withdrew to a smaller chamber adjacent to the great hall, where a fire crackled in a stone hearth and tapestries depicting hunting scenes provided some privacy from listening ears. Finnegan waited until the door was closed before crossing the room to embrace her with the fierce affection of an uncle greeting a beloved niece. "Child," he said, his voice breaking with suppressed emotion, "when word reached us that you lived, that you had not only survived but thrived in this northern fortress, your brother wept tears of joy for the first time since our defeat. How does he fare?" Marci asked, drinking in the familiar sound of her native tongue and the comfort of speaking with someone who had known her before the world changed. "He is strong, wiser than his years should allow, and beloved by those he leads. The Confederation stretches from the western shores to the great mountains. Now 12 clans have sworn to follow him, and more considered joining our cause each season." Finnegan's words painted a picture of resurgence that filled Marci with pride and hope, but also with a growing sense of the impossible position in which she found herself. Her brother had built something magnificent from the ashes of their father's defeat, but that very success might now depend on her choices. "What does he propose?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. "An end to the endless cycle of raid and revenge," Finnegan replied. "Formal borders that both sides will respect, trade agreements that will bring prosperity to all, and," he paused, his weathered face growing serious, "a marriage alliance that would make you the bridge between our peoples." The word she had been dreading hung in the air between them. "To whom?" "Your brother leaves the choice to you, but he suggests Padrig of the northern clans, a good man, a strong leader, and one who would treat you with the honor due to your station." Marci remembered Padrig vaguely, a young man her own age who had visited her father's court on occasion, serious and well-spoken, but someone she had never considered in romantic terms. Now he was apparently a clan chieftain in his own right, and marriage to him would cement alliances that could bring peace to thousands. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Finnegan's expression grew troubled. "Then your brother will respect your choice, but the opportunity for peace may be lost. Without the marriage alliance, the Confederation cannot trust that this Bjorn will honor his agreements. Too many promises have been broken, too much blood has been spilled." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Astrid entered with refreshments and news that made Marci's blood run cold. "My lady," the head servant said quietly, "Lord Bjorn requests that you return to the hall. Magnus Bloodaxe's advance riders have been spotted from the watchtowers. He will be here by tomorrow evening." The timing compressed everything into impossible urgency. Decisions that should have been contemplated for weeks would need to be made in hours, with the fate of 2 peoples hanging in the balance. When they returned to the great hall, they found Bjorn studying a crude map drawn on a piece of treated leather. His war captain stood around the table, pointing out defensive positions and discussing tactics with the grim efficiency of men who had faced death many times before. "The news grows grimmer," Bjorn announced as Marci and Finnegan rejoined the assembly. "Our scouts report that Magnus comes with more than the 200 warriors originally expected. He has gathered support from Jarls, who question my recent innovations in governance. Nearly 400 men march under his banner." Eric's face had gone pale at the numbers. 400 warriors was a force large enough to overwhelm their defenses if it came to a siege, and in single combat, Magnus's reputation was such that few men would have wanted to face him even on their best day. "However," Bjorn continued, his gaze moving to the Celtic envoys, "if the terms proposed by Cormac the prized is being jury, bold or genuine, we may have alternatives to facing this threat alone." Finnegan stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, in a gesture that was both respectful and ready. "My lord has authorized me to offer immediate military assistance if an alliance can be struck. 200 Celtic warriors wait in the forests beyond your borders, ready to march if called upon." The offer sent a murmur through the Viking assembly. Celtic warriors fighting alongside Vikings against other Vikings would be unprecedented, but it might also be their only hope of survival. Sven's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. "And what guarantee do we have that these Celts will not simply wait for us to weaken each other before striking at the survivors? This reeks of a trap designed to destroy both Magnus and Bjorn, leaving the western lands open for Celtic expansion." "The guarantee," Finnegan replied with dignity that brooked no insult, "would be the marriage alliance between Lady Marci and one of our chieftains. Blood ties that make betrayal impossible." All eyes turned to Marci, and she felt the weight of history pressing down upon her. In her hands lay the power to bring peace or to allow war to continue its endless harvest of young lives. But accepting the marriage would mean leaving Bjorn, leaving the life she had built in this northern stronghold, leaving behind the man she had come to love more deeply than she had ever imagined possible. Bjorn's war horn hung on the wall behind his chair, the instrument that had called his warriors to countless battles, that would summon them to what might be their final stand against Magnus's overwhelming force. The horn's polished surface seemed to reflect not just firelight, but the souls of all those who had answered its call over the years. "I need time to consider," Marci said finally, her voice barely audible in the vast hall. "Time is what we lack," Eric said harshly. "Magnus will be here tomorrow. If we are to have Celtic support, the alliance must be sealed tonight." "Then tonight it shall be decided," Bjorn said, with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "But the choice must be Marci's alone. I will not compel her to sacrifice her happiness for political necessity." As the day wore on and preparations for either battle or negotiation continued around her, Marci found herself torn between loyalties that seemed impossible to reconcile. Her heart belonged to Bjorn and the life they had built together, but her blood and her duty called her back to the people she had been born to serve. The war horn seemed to watch her with the patience of an ancient god, waiting to see whether its next call would summon allies or enemies, peace or war, salvation or destruction. Dawn brought the sound of war horns echoing across the fjord, not Bjorn's call to arms, but the harsh braying of Magnus Bloodaxe's approach. From the walls of the settlement, Marci could see the dark mass of his army spreading across the valley like a plague of locusts, their shields and spear points glinting in the pale morning light. 400 warriors had become nearly 500 overnight as fence-sitting Jarls chose Magnus's proven brutality over Bjorn's untested reforms. The night had passed without sleep for anyone in the settlement. Marci had spent the dark hours walking the ramparts, wrestling with a decision that felt like choosing between her soul and her duty. Beside her now stood Bjorn, his massive frame encased in the war gear that had made him legendary chainmail that had turned aside 100 enemy blades, a helm crowned with raven wings, and the great axe his father had carried to glory and death. "You could still leave," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the approaching army. "Slip away with the Celtic envoys before the fighting begins. No one would think less of you for choosing survival." Marci's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where the iron shackles of her slavery had been replaced by the silver brooch of her Celtic heritage. The transformation from slave to princess felt surreal, like a story told around winter fires rather than the reality of her own life. "I cannot abandon those who showed me kindness when I had nothing to offer in return," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her bones. "Whatever happens today, I will face it here." Below them, Magnus's army had begun to spread into battle formation with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. At their center, Magnus himself was easily recognizable, a giant of a man whose red hair and beard seemed to burn like flame in the morning light. Even at this distance, his presence radiated the kind of violence that had made him feared from Greenland to the Baltic shores. Eric appeared at their side, his own war gear gleaming with the nervous energy of a young man about to face his first truly desperate battle. "Father, the men are ready, but we are outnumbered 3-1, and Magnus has positioned archers on the high ground." Bjorn nodded grimly. The tactical situation was exactly as bad as it appeared. Magnus had chosen his approach carefully, using the terrain to maximize his advantages while minimizing Bjorn's ability to use the settlement's defenses effectively. "What word from the Celtic envoys?" Bjorn asked. "They await Lady Marci's decision," Eric replied, though his tone suggested he thought the delay was madness. 200 warriors could turn the tide, but they will not move without the marriage alliance. The weight of 500 lives pressed down on Marci's shoulders. Every warrior in Magnus's army, every defender on the walls, every woman and child sheltering in the halls below, all their fates hung on her willingness to sacrifice her personal happiness for the greater good. A commotion near the main gate drew their attention. A small party approached under a banner of truce. Magnus himself, flanked by his most trusted lieutenants, come to offer terms before the slaughter began. It was a formality that honor demanded, though everyone knew what those terms would be. "I should go to the Celtic envoys," Marci said, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on still water. "Tell them no." Bjorn's voice cut across her words with surprising gentleness. "First, we hear what Magnus offers. Perhaps there is still a path that does not require such sacrifice." They descended to the great hall, where Magnus waited with the casual arrogance of a predator certain of his prey. He had removed his helm out of courtesy, revealing a face that seemed carved from granite and marked by countless scars. When his eyes fell on Marci, they glittered with interest that made her skin crawl. "So this is the Celtic witch who has bewitched the great Bjorn Ironside," Magnus said, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who had spent his life shouting orders over the clash of weapons. "She is prettier than the stories suggested." "State your terms, Magnus," Bjorn replied, his own voice deadly calm. "Simple enough. You step down as Jarl, acknowledge my leadership of these lands, and perhaps I allow your people to live as my thralls rather than feeding them to the ravens." Magnus's smile revealed teeth stained with blood from a recent meal. "As for the girl, well, a curiosity like her would make an interesting addition to my collection." The casual cruelty of the proposal sent ice through Marci's veins, but it also clarified her choice with perfect, terrible clarity. There would be no negotiation with Magnus, no compromise that preserved either her freedom or Bjorn's honor. The only alternatives were victory or death. "I reject your terms," Bjorn said, with the finality of a mountain rejecting the tide. Magnus's laugh was like the sound of breaking bones. "I expected nothing less. When you lie dying in the mud, remember that your pride brought nothing but pain for those you claim to protect." As the would-be conqueror departed to rejoin his army, Marci turned to face the Celtic envoys, who had been waiting in tense silence throughout the exchange. Finnegan's eyes met hers with understanding and sadness, recognizing the decision she was about to make. "Send word to my brother," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with ringing clarity. "Tell him that Marci, daughter of Cormac, accepts the marriage alliance. Tell him to send his warriors immediately." The words felt like chains breaking rather than chains being forged, and as Finnegan bowed deeply before hurrying to carry out her command, Marci felt the last of her old life fall away like discarded shackles. The battle began with the sound of Celtic war horns answering Bjorn's call from the western hills, their haunting notes weaving through the morning air like the voices of ancient spirits. Magnus had positioned his forces for a siege, but the arrival of 200 Celtic warriors at his rear transformed the tactical situation entirely. What should have been a methodical assault became a desperate fight for survival, as Magnus found himself caught between hammer and anvil. Marci stood on the ramparts, watching the transformation unfold below, her heart hammering against her ribs as she witnessed the confluence of two worlds she had never imagined could work together. Celtic warriors in their distinctive mail and bright cloaks charged alongside Viking defenders, their battle cries blending into a symphony of defiance that echoed off the fjord's stone walls. But the sight that held her attention was not the grand sweep of battle. It was the solitary figure of Eric, who had frozen at the moment of decision when Sven called on him to honor their secret agreement. The young man stood in the settlement's main courtyard, his sword half drawn, torn between family loyalty and the ambition that Sven had carefully cultivated. "Now, boy," Sven shouted over the time, "clash of weapons. Strike down your father while his attention is on the enemy. Magnus will reward those who aid his victory." Eric's face was a mask of anguish as he looked between his father, who fought with the skill and fury that had made him legendary, and Sven, who represented the path to power that Eric had been promised. The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring, with the fate of the battle hanging on the choice of a young man caught between duty and desire. The decision came not from Eric, but from an unexpected source. Astrid, the head servant who had mothered Marci through her years of slavery, appeared behind Sven with a kitchen knife in her weathered hands. "No," she said with quiet determination, "not while I draw breath." The blade took Sven in the back, sliding between his ribs with the precision of someone who had spent decades preparing meat for the table. He staggered forward, surprise and pain warring on his face as he turned to see his attacker. "You," he gasped, blood frothing on his lips. "You are nothing, a slave, a servant. I am someone who remembers loyalty," Astrid replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she had done. "Someone who knows the difference between serving good masters and enabling evil ones." Sven's death broke whatever spell had held Eric paralyzed. With a cry that might have been rage or relief, he turned his blade toward Magnus's forces and charged into the battle with the fury of a man who had finally chosen his side. The fighting raged for what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes. Marci watched Bjorn cut through enemy warriors like a force of nature unleashed, his great axe rising and falling with rhythmic precision, while Celtic warriors pressed Magnus's flanks with disciplined ferocity. The tide of battle was turning, but slowly, and at a cost measured in blood and broken bodies. Then, across the chaos, she saw a banner that made her heart leap with recognition. The crowned stag of her father's house, carried by a warrior whose bearing was unmistakably familiar even at a distance. Cormac had come himself, leading his personal guard in a charge that struck Magnus's center like a thunderbolt. The reunion of siblings separated by 7 years of war and suffering happened in the midst of carnage. But for a moment that transcended the violence around them, the world contracted to just the two of them. Cormac's arms wrapped around her with fierce protectiveness, and she could feel his tears mixing with the dirt and sweat on her face. "Sister," he whispered in the old tongue, "I thought I had lost you forever." "I thought the same of you," she replied, drinking in the sight of his face, older, scarred, marked by the responsibilities of leadership, but still recognizably the brother who had taught her to read the stars and told her stories of heroes who changed the world through courage rather than conquest. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of Magnus's voice roaring challenges above the din of battle. The giant warrior had carved his way through the press of fighters to reach Bjorn, and now the two leaders faced each other in a circle of cleared ground as their armies fought on around them. "Come then, Ironside," Magnus bellowed, his massive sword gleaming with blood. "Let us settle this as our fathers did, with steel and strength." The single combat that followed was like watching gods at war. Both men were legends, but Magnus was younger and had spent his life in constant warfare, while Bjorn carried the weight of years and the accumulated damage of countless battles. Yet what Bjorn lacked in youth, he made up for in wisdom and the desperate strength of a man fighting for everything he held dear. The duel's conclusion came not from superior skill, but from an unexpected source. As Magnus raised his sword for a killing blow, Marci's voice rang out across the battlefield, carrying words in the old Celtic tongue that froze every warrior within hearing. "Behold, Cormac's banner," she cried, pointing to where her brother's standard flew triumphant over a field of defeated enemies. "The Peace Weaver has spoken. Let those who would have unity lay down their arms." The ancient ritual of the Peace Weaver, a woman of royal blood, calling for an end to bloodshed, carried weight that transcended the immediate politics of the battle. Magnus hesitated, his sword wavering, and in that moment of uncertainty, Bjorn's axe found its mark. 3 months had passed since the battle that changed everything, and the great hall that had once echoed with the clash of opposing wills now resonated with laughter and the sound of children playing. The marriage ceremony had taken place as the autumn leaves turned gold, uniting not just Marci and Bjorn, but symbolically joining two peoples who had known nothing but conflict for generations. The new throne that dominated the hall's far end bore the carved symbols of both cultures. Celtic knots intertwined with Viking runes, oak leaves embracing ravens, the crowned stag standing beside the war eagle. It had been crafted by artisans from both peoples working together, their different styles creating something entirely new, yet rooted in ancient traditions. When Marci sat beside Bjorn on that throne, she no longer felt the weight of choosing between loyalties. She had found a way to honor both. The changes extended far beyond symbolic gestures. The former slave quarters had been transformed into housing for families, while the old strict hierarchy had given way to a council system where voices from all levels of society could be heard. Thorvald, the young man whose theft had once seemed so threatening, now served as the settlement's chief administrator, his intimate knowledge of hunger and desperation making him surprisingly effective at managing resources fairly. Eric had embraced his role as heir to this new form of leadership with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. The bitter young man who had once resented Marci's influence had become one of her strongest supporters, recognizing that strength could take many forms beyond the warrior's code he had been raised to worship. "The Southern Jarls send their acceptance," he announced, entering the hall with a leather pouch full of carved tokens. "Jarl Thorson pledges his allegiance to the new confederation, and even Jarl Eriksson admits that our methods have proven effective." Marci smiled as she reviewed the messages. Word of their success had spread across the northern territories like ripples in a pond, inspiring other leaders to experiment with governance based on wisdom rather than fear alone. The transformation was slow, measured in seasons rather than days, but it was real and growing stronger. Cormac had remained through the winter, helping to negotiate the complex web of agreements that formalized the peace between Celtic and Viking territories. His presence had been a gift beyond measure, the chance to know her brother as an adult, to understand the man he had become through years of leadership and loss. They had spent countless evenings by the fire, sharing stories that bridged the gap between their divergent experiences and weaving together the broken threads of their family history. "You have built something remarkable here," he said one evening as they walked together along the fjord's edge. "Father would be proud of what you have accomplished." "We have built it together," Marci replied, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where new life grew. "All of us, Viking and Celt, former slave and former master." The child I carry will inherit a world where such distinctions matter less than the content of one's character. The pregnancy had been announced just as the last snows melted, and the joy it brought seemed to seal the transformation in ways that treaties and ceremonies could not. This child would be the first of a new generation, neither fully Viking nor fully Celtic, but something entirely new, a living symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conquest. Helga, now recognized as the settlement's chief advisor on matters both practical and mystical, had proclaimed the pregnancy, a sign that the gods smiled upon their endeavors. The ancient vulva had adapted to the changes with surprising grace, finding in the new order a fulfillment of prophecies she had carried for decades. "The bridge between worlds grows stronger," she said, running her weathered hands over Marci's belly in blessing. "This child will know peace as their birthright, rather than war as their inheritance." Even the daily rhythms of life had transformed. The great hall that had once seen slaves serving masters now hosted communal meals where former enemies sat together, sharing food and stories while their children played at their feet. The rigid protocols of Viking society had given way to something more fluid, more human, more sustainable. Astrid, elevated to the role of household steward in recognition of her courage and wisdom, oversaw these changes with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice finally done. The woman who had once warned Marci to remain invisible now took pride in her protégé's prominence, understanding that some risks were worth taking even when the outcome seemed impossible. "You asked for leftovers," she said one evening as they supervised the preparation of a feast to celebrate the first successful harvest under the new system. "Instead, you created abundance for everyone." The words echoed back to that moment 7 months ago, when hunger and desperation had given Marci the courage to speak words that changed everything. The half-eaten joint of venison that had started it all seemed like a relic from another age, a reminder of how small actions could have enormous consequences. As evening fell and the aurora danced across the star-filled sky, Marci stood with Bjorn on the same ramparts where they had once watched Magnus's army approach. Now the lights that dotted the landscape were those of allied settlements, Celtic and Viking communities that had chosen cooperation over conflict. "Do you ever regret it?" Bjorn asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "The choice you made, the life you gave up to make this possible?" Marci considered the question seriously, thinking of all the paths not taken and the futures that might have been. Then she felt the child move within her, a gentle reminder of the life they were creating together, and smiled. "I gave up nothing," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had found their true purpose. "I gained everything I never knew I wanted." The aurora continued its ancient dance overhead, painting the sky in sheets of green and gold that seemed to bless their union and the peace they had built together. Below them, the settlement slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring abundance rather than want, cooperation rather than conflict, hope rather than fear. In the end, it had all begun with a simple question asked in desperation by a slave who dared to speak. The answer had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can reshape the world.